This is the story of a man who did everything right. The concrete mix, the drainage gradient, the flood elevation, every millimeter to specification, and still lost it all because he never checked the one thing his professional training had never taught him to measure. What you are about to hear is a message sent to me by a viewer named Peter, a Dutch civil engineer who spent 34 years of his career learning how to build structures that would stand for 60 years, and who used every single one of those years of expertise to build the most beautiful house he had ever designed. He built it on the correct foundation. He specified the correct materials. He supervised every stage of the construction personally. And when it was finished, when the paint was dry and the tiles were laid and the family who was supposed to live in it had moved in, the ground beneath everything he thought he had built simply gave way. Not because his engineering was wrong, because he had built the wrong thing, for the wrong reason, on ground he never asked the right questions about. Before I turn this over to Peter to tell you in his own words, I want you to know that this is not the story of a man who was stupid. This is the story of a man who was very, very good at his profession, and who discovered that professional excellence is not the same thing as understanding what you have really been asked to build. My name is Peter Hendrik Vandermeersch. I am 67 years old. I live in Eindhoven in the south of the Netherlands, and I need to tell you about the most expensive thing I ever built and the one measurement I forgot to take. If you've been enjoying the stories I tell, please consider hitting the subscribe button. Your support is crucial for the growth of this channel and helps me dedicate time to making these videos despite my commitment to a full-time job. Thank you for being here. I want to start by telling you what kind of man I was before any of this began, because I think it matters. I was not a lonely divorced tourist who came to Southeast Asia looking for a young woman to take care of me. I was not naive about Vietnam. I was not naive about anything, in fact. And that is part of what makes what happened to me so difficult to sit with even now, 3 years after the last brick was laid on the house that took everything. I spent my working life as a civil engineer, specializing in water management and flood control infrastructure. 34 years of it, most of them at a large consulting firm in Eindhoven, doing work that took me all over the world, but especially to Southeast Asia. The Netherlands is a country that lives below sea level in half its territory, and Dutch engineers have made a small international specialty of teaching other countries how to hold water back, how to move it, how to live with rivers that rise and deltas that flood. In the last 15 years of my career, I made close to 20 trips to Vietnam. I worked on projects in the Mekong Delta, in Con Th, in Soc Trong, in An Giang. I sat in meetings with provincial water management officials, in offices where the fans turned slowly, and the tea was always warm, and the officials were always more patient than my Dutch colleagues expected them to be. I learned a few hundred words of Vietnamese, enough to be polite, enough to greet a family and thank a cook and say goodbye without embarrassment. I understood, in the way that only someone who has walked the rice fields in April can understand, what the river meant to the people who lived beside it. I mention all of this because I need you to see that I was not a man who arrived in Vietnam knowing nothing. I was a man who arrived in Vietnam knowing quite a lot, and I am going to tell you a story about how none of that knowledge protected me from what happened. This is a story about the difference between technical expertise and human wisdom, and about how a lifetime of one does not, in any way, guarantee even a beginner's share of the other. I was married for 29 years to a woman named Enki. She was a school teacher, kind and steady, and we raised 2 children together in a good brick house in a quiet neighborhood of Eindhoven. Our daughter Liesbeth is 38 now, married, working in Utrecht as a researcher at a public health institute. Our son Joris is 35, a graphic designer in Breda, quieter than his sister and always harder for me to read. The marriage did not end badly. It ended the way marriages end, when a man has spent 34 years traveling for work and coming home tired and answering his wife's questions about the day in as few words as he can manage before opening his laptop. Again. It ended because there was nothing left in it, on either side. Anke was the one who finally said it. I did not fight her. We divided the house, we divided the savings, We told the children with as much dignity as we could manage, and I moved into an apartment on the other side of Eindhoven with a view of a canal and started, at 62, the strange work of being alone. For the first 2 years, I told myself I was fine. I had my work. I had my grown children who I saw for Sunday lunch every second week. I had a handful of colleagues I still had a beer with on Friday evenings. I read more than I had in decades. I took long walks along the canal. I convinced myself that being alone was simply a different phase of life, no worse than any other, and that I had the constitution to live it well. I was lying to myself, of course. The evenings were long. The weekends were longer. I would go for days without speaking a full sentence to another human being outside of a shop or an office. I began to notice that when I did have a conversation, I would talk too much and too fast, like a man releasing pressure from a tank that had been sealed too long. It was in that phase of my life, at 64, that I met the woman I later married. I met her online. There is no point in pretending otherwise, but I want to be clear about the platform because it matters. It was not a dating app for men looking for young Southeast Asian brides. It was a general international dating site aimed at older adults, the kind of site where a widow in Rotterdam might message a widower in Antwerp. I had made a plain profile there, with a real photograph of myself in a shirt and a jacket. And I had said honestly that I was a divorced Dutch engineer with grown children who spent time in Vietnam for work and would be interested in meeting someone thoughtful, whether Dutch or otherwise. I was not shopping for exoticism. I was, if I am being truthful, hoping to find someone who might understand that the country I had spent my career working in mattered to me, and who would not require me to translate what it meant. Her name was Lê Thier Ngoc Than. She went by Ngoc. Her profile said she was 39 years old, that she worked in a district government office in Long Xuan, in An Giang province, that she was divorced with no children, that she spoke serviceable English and was interested in improving it, and that she wanted to meet a foreign man who was serious rather than a tourist. There were 3 photographs. In one, she was standing in front of a public building in a modest blouse and dark trousers, looking directly at the camera with an expression that was neither flirtatious nor guarded. In another, she was at what looked like a family lunch, her hair pulled back, laughing at something out of frame. In the third, she was standing beside a river with an older woman I later learned was her mother. I looked at those photographs for a long time before I wrote to her. I want you to understand something about my state of mind. It was not the beauty of the photographs that stopped me. She was an attractive woman, but not remarkably so. Not one of the airbrushed 22-year-olds I had learned to swipe past. What stopped me was the ordinariness, the blouse, the public building, the mother beside the river. It looked like a real life. It looked like a woman I might actually meet in Long Xuan and have a real conversation with over a plate of grilled fish. I wrote her a short message in careful English, mentioning that I had worked on flood control projects in An Giang and had spent time in Long Xuan, that I remembered the town's park along the Her River, that I hoped my message was not intrusive. She replied within a day, in English, that was slightly formal and slightly imperfect, saying she remembered the Dutch engineering team that had come to the province several years earlier and that her uncle worked in the department that had liaised with them. She named the department correctly. She named the road it was on. That was the first hook, though I did not think of it as a hook at the time. I thought of it as a coincidence that made the world feel smaller. We wrote to each other for 4 months before I saw her in person. The messages were long, thoughtful, unhurried. She would tell me about her workday, about the office politics she navigated, about the small pleasures of a Sunday morning at the market. I would tell her about my apartment in Eindhoven, about my slow adjustment to retirement, about my children whom I loved and did not quite know how to reach. She never asked me for anything. She never mentioned money. She never dropped hints about difficulties in her life or her family's life. If anything, she was almost too composed, too proud of her modest independence. When I once mentioned that I was thinking of sending a small gift to thank her for the time she had taken to write to me, she said, very simply, that gifts made her uncomfortable and would I please not send one. It was the exact response of a self-respecting woman who did not want a foreign man to think she could be purchased for anything, and it made me trust her more than any other single thing she did in the first year of our correspondence. When I finally traveled to Longjuan, it was on the back of a consultancy engagement, not a romantic pilgrimage. A former colleague at my old firm had recommended me for a short advisory role on a Delta Rice Terrace drainage question. 3 weeks of work, well paid, with the added benefit that I would be spending most of that time in Enjang. Nok knew I was coming. We had agreed that we would meet, that we would take it slowly, that neither of us would expect anything. I met her for lunch in a small restaurant on Weirn Tri Street on the second day of my trip. She was exactly the woman in her photographs, no more and no less. She was slightly nervous, so was I. We talked for 3 hours about her work and mine, about the province, about my children, about her mother's arthritis and her father's stubbornness. She asked intelligent questions about the drainage project I had come to advise on and understood the answers better than I expected. When the meal was over, she paid for her own lunch, over my objection, and said that if I wanted to see her again during my stay, that would be nice, and that if I did not, she would understand. That was how our relationship began. Slowly, with dignity, with money kept clearly out of it. I saw her 4 more times during that 3-week trip. She met me at cafes, not at hotels. On the second week, she introduced me to her mother, briefly, at the market. On the third week, I met her father over a cup of tea in his small yard. Nothing about the encounter felt engineered. Everything about it felt like a woman who had thought seriously about whether she wanted to open her life to a foreign man, and had decided, cautiously, that she did. I flew back to Eindhoven at the end of that consultancy with the sense that something real had begun. Over the next 3.5 years, we built a relationship that no one in my life had reason to doubt. I went to Vietnam every few months for stays of 2 or 3 weeks. She came to the Netherlands twice on tourist visas that she obtained through her own effort and paid for out of her own salary. My daughter Lisbeth met her on the second of those visits and told me afterwards that Ingark seemed thoughtful and grounded and that she was glad for me. My son Joris met her too and said less, because Joris says less about everything but did not object. We married 2.5 years into the relationship in a small civil ceremony in Longjuan, attended by her family and by 2 Dutch friends. I flew in for the occasion. There was no dowry. There was no request for anything. Her father made a short speech in Vietnamese that her cousin translated for me, in which he said that his daughter was a serious woman who had waited a long time to marry again, and that he was glad the man she had chosen was a serious man too. I remember thinking at that moment that I had finally, in the 6th decade of my life, found what I had been looking for. I want to be honest with you about something before I go further. In the 18 months between our marriage and the day the house was completed, I was as happy as I have ever been in my life. Not in a giddy adolescent way, in a settled, quiet adult way. I would wake up in the small rented apartment we shared in Longjuan with the sound of the neighborhood coming to life outside the shutters, and I would drink a cup of tea on the balcony with Nok, and I would feel that all the years of empty evenings in Eindhoven had ended. That is important, I think, because the story I am telling would be easier to tell if I could say that I had been unhappy the whole time, that the warning signs had been there, that I was suspicious but ignored my instincts. None of that would be true. I was a contented man, building a life with a woman I loved. The story is worse because that is true. The house project began the way many disasters begin, which is to say, from an act of generosity that I proposed myself. Ingok did not ask me for it. She never asked me for anything. The house was my idea, and I need you to understand that clearly, because it is the pivot on which everything else turned. Ngok's parents lived in a small wooden house on a plot of land at the edge of Longjuan, in a semi-rural neighborhood where the paved road ended and the packed earth lanes began. The house had been built by her grandfather in the 1960s, extended once in the 1980s, and patched many times since. The roof leaked in the rainy season. The kitchen was a lean-to under a corrugated sheet. The bathroom was outside. Her father, whose name was Le Vun Tam, was 70 years old, a retired district agricultural officer with a small pension. Her mother, Bui Thierlan was 67, still working 3 days a week at a relative's fabric shop. Her younger brother, Lê Van Phuc, 40, lived nearby with his wife and 2 children in a rented apartment that was too small for them. I had visited the house perhaps a dozen times over the course of my relationship with Ngark. I had drunk tea in the front room, eaten meals at the low table, played a card game once with her father, watched her mother chop vegetables in the lean-to kitchen. I had noticed, in the way an engineer cannot help noticing, that the house was tired, that the beams were sagging in one corner, that the drainage around the foundation was allowing water to pool during the rains, that the electrical wiring, run overhead in the old style, was in the kind of condition that would not have been legal in any European country for 40 years. The idea came to me one evening about 8 months into our marriage, when I was sitting on the balcony of our rented apartment with Ngak after a visit to her parents. Her mother had complained in her light way that the roof had leaked again during a storm that week, and that they had put buckets in the front room to catch the water. Her father had been quieter than usual that day, in the way older men become quieter when they are aware of a problem they cannot solve. On the balcony that evening, I said to Ngak, half thinking aloud, that a proper house on that plot would be a straightforward project. The land was there. The layout was obvious. A 1-story concrete construction, well elevated for flood resistance, with a proper roof and proper drainage and proper wiring, would give her parents a home that would outlast them by decades. It would cost, I estimated in my head, somewhere between 250,000 and 300,000 euros done well. I could do that, I said. I would like to do that. Ngak was quiet for a long time. Then she said, very carefully, that it was too much, that she could not accept a gift of that size for her family, that I had already given her so much simply by being in her life, and that she did not want money to come between us and her parents. She said all the things a self-respecting woman should say when a foreign husband proposes to spend a large sum on her family, and she said them convincingly, and she said them without any of the small tells that would have made a more cynical man suspicious. I persuaded her. I want you to hear that clearly. I persuaded her to accept a gift she was reluctant to receive. That is how the con was engineered, not through her asking. Through my proposing, and through her declining, and through my insisting, and through her yielding, gracefully, only after I had convinced her that this was something I wanted to do for reasons of my own. Before I go further, I want to pause on the legal situation, because it is where the trap was set. Foreigners cannot own land in Vietnam. This is a simple fact of Vietnamese law, and I knew it before I ever proposed the house. What I understood, professionally, was that a foreigner can own the physical structure of a building for a period, but cannot own the land beneath it, and that the land use rights must be held by a Vietnamese citizen. What I understood in principle, I failed to interrogate in practice. The consequence of building a house on land you do not own, in a country whose legal system will not easily side with a foreigner in a family dispute, is that the house effectively belongs to whoever holds the land use rights. I knew this. I said it to myself, and then I proceeded as if it were a technicality, rather than the central fact of the entire project. We consulted a local Vietnamese lawyer in Long Xuyen before construction began. He was a competent, professional man, and he explained the arrangement clearly. The land use rights were registered jointly in the names of Ngak's parents. That was the correct legal structure, he said. There was no way for me, as a foreigner, to be added to the title. There was no way for Ngak, as a married daughter, to be given a formal share while her parents were living. What could be done, he said, was that a written agreement could be drafted between me and the family, acknowledging that the funds for the construction had come from me, and expressing the family's understanding that the house was a marital gift intended to benefit Ngak and me during our lifetimes. That is what we did. I have that document. It is signed by Ngak's parents, by Ngak, and by me, and it is witnessed and stamped. It is, I now understand, worth almost nothing in a Vietnamese court. It expresses an understanding. It does not create a legal right. But at the time, with a good lawyer's calm voice explaining that this was the standard arrangement, that many foreign husbands had made similar arrangements, that in a functioning family it was more than sufficient. I signed it, and I felt reassured. I was a professional man dealing with another professional man. The paperwork was in order. The engineering could begin. I designed the house myself. I want to describe it because it matters to me, and because the pride I felt in building it well is part of the wound. The plot was a rectangle, roughly 20 meters by 40 meters, running back from the packed earth lane toward a small tributary of the Her. The tributary flooded in the wet season, sometimes seriously. My first design decision was to elevate the house on a raised concrete plinth, 1 meter and 20 centimeters above the highest recorded flood level in that section of the neighborhood over the previous 30 years. I sourced the flood data from the Provincial Water Management Office, from records I had helped compile during one of my consultancies years earlier. I added a further 30 centimeters of margin for climate projections. The plinth alone cost 45,000 euros in materials and labor, and it was the single best piece of engineering I had ever done in a civilian context. The house itself was a single story, 140 square meters, laid out in a shape that took advantage of the prevailing breeze from the river. 4 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms with modern plumbing, a proper kitchen with tiled surfaces and a stovetop and a fume extractor, a large front room with a ceiling fan and windows on 2 walls, an interior corridor that ran the length of the house so that no bedroom would be a passage room for another. I specified the concrete mix myself, upgraded to a Portland cement blend more resistant to the delta's humidity. I specified reinforcement bars sized for lateral seismic loading, even though Anjiang is not a seismic zone, because I had learned from a Japanese colleague years ago that seismic-grade rebar simply lasts longer against corrosion. The roof was a hip design, sloped at 32 degrees to shed the monsoon rain cleanly, with a proper vapor barrier and insulation of a kind unusual in Vietnamese domestic construction. The gutters ran to a rainwater collection system I had specified myself, feeding a 5,000-liter cistern buried in the yard. I hired a small Vietnamese architectural and engineering firm from Con Tho to translate my designs into local drawings and to supervise the day-to-day construction. I paid them properly, 20,000 euros for the full consultancy, and they were, in my professional judgment, excellent. The contractor was a local Longshuan firm recommended by the architects, and I insisted on paying his workers on time every week at rates slightly above the local going wage, which the contractor initially resisted and then came to appreciate. Construction took 9 months. I flew back and forth from Eindhoven throughout that time, spending roughly half the year in Long Xuyen, staying with Ngoc in our rented apartment and visiting the construction site every morning to walk the works. Ngoc's mother, Bui Thirlan, took to bringing lunch to the site every day. She would arrive at midday with 2 cloth bags of covered dishes, and she would set them out on a folding table under a canvas awning the contractor had rigged. And she would feed me, and whichever workers were on site that hour, with the same wordless generosity with which she had always fed me at her own house. In the last 3 months of the build, when the walls were up and the roof was on and the interior finishes were being installed, I would take my lunch at that folding table and look at the house rising from the plinth I had designed and think that this was the finest thing my hands had ever helped to make. The materials budget all in came to 155,000 euros. Finishes, tile, fixtures, and interior fittings added another 60,000. The generator I insisted on, for flood season resilience, and the landscaping and the furnishings for the parents' initial move-in came to another 10,000. Combined with the plinth and the consultancy, the total cost of the house was 290,000 euros. Every one of those euros was documented. I kept a spreadsheet from the first day of the project to the last. I kept every invoice, every receipt, every bank transfer confirmation, every material delivery slip. I have, in a black 3-ring binder in my Eindhoven apartment, the complete financial and technical record of that construction. It is the most beautiful documentation I have ever assembled. It proves, conclusively and beyond any possibility of question, exactly what I paid and exactly what I built. It is also the most useless document I have ever produced in my life. I will come to that. The house was finished at the end of the 9th month of construction. There was a formal handover of sorts. Nock's parents moved in on a Saturday. Her brother Levon Fook and his wife and children moved into 2 of the 4 bedrooms on the same day, an arrangement that had been discussed and agreed upon during the build, on the understanding that the parents would take the larger master bedroom and that the extra rooms would house the brother's family until they could afford their own place. I did not object. I had built the house with the family in mind. It felt right that the family should fill it. I have a photograph from that Saturday. I look at it more often than is healthy for me. In the photograph, Nock's parents are standing on the elevated front porch of the new house, dressed formally, her father in a pressed shirt and her mother in a good dye. Her brother stands slightly behind them with his wife. Nock is at the center of the group, and I am beside her with my arm around her shoulders. The front door is painted the color her mother had chosen, a deep glossy green that looked good against the pale plaster of the walls. Everyone is smiling. I am smiling wider than anyone. I look, in that photograph, like a man at the completion of a project he has poured his life into, which is what I was. The photograph is dated. 48 days later. Nock told me she needed time apart. I did not see it coming. That is the first and most important thing I have to say about the 6 weeks that followed the move-in day. I did not see it coming, because there was nothing to see. She did not withdraw dramatically. She did not pick fights. She did not become cold overnight. What she did was so gradual and so subtle that even now, when I try to reconstruct it, I cannot point to a single moment when I ought to have known. The first week after the move-in, she was busy helping her parents settle. That made sense to me. Furniture arrived. Small adjustments were made. Her mother wanted certain items rearranged in the kitchen. Nock was at her parents' new house every day, sometimes twice a day, and she was often tired in the evenings. I did not think anything of it. The second week, she said she needed to spend more time at her office because there had been some kind of internal reorganization that required her attention. This was plausible. She had mentioned office reorganizations before over the years of our marriage, and they had always been genuine. She began coming home later. She began being on her phone in the evenings, in the other room, in conversations that she did not narrate to me when she came back to sit on the couch. The third week, she began sleeping in the second bedroom of our rented apartment. She said her back had been hurting and that our mattress was too soft, and that she would sleep in the other bed until she had bought a firmer mattress for our own room. She never bought the mattress. She never returned to our room. The fourth week, the small silences began. A comment I would make at breakfast that she would not respond to. A question I would ask her at dinner that she would answer in as few words as possible before returning her attention to her phone. I remember one evening, at the end of the fourth week, sitting across from her at our small kitchen table and asking her whether something was wrong, whether I had done something to upset her. She looked up from her phone and smiled a smile that was not a smile and said no, that she was simply tired, that the reorganization at work was more demanding than she had expected. I told myself I believed her. The fifth week, her brother Levon Fook began calling me directly. He had never done this before. He called to say that there was a small problem with the electrical wiring in one of the bedrooms of the new house, and could I come look at it? I went. It was a minor problem, a loose connection at an outlet that had probably worked itself loose during the move-in. I fixed it in 10 minutes. 2 days later, he called again to say there was a small problem with the plumbing under one of the bathroom sinks. I went. It was a slightly leaky trap. I tightened it. He thanked me warmly and offered me tea and asked how I was. And I remember thinking, on the ride back to the apartment, that at least Ngok's brother still seemed glad to see me. The sixth week, Ngok told me she needed to talk. We sat on the balcony of our rented apartment, in the same chairs where we had once discussed the house project. She said that the marriage was not working, that she felt she had rushed into it, that she needed time apart to think, that she was not saying we were finished, but that she needed to move out for a while, back to her parents' house, back to where she had space and family around her, and that she thought I should perhaps consider returning to the Netherlands for a period. She said all of this calmly, kindly, without hostility. She said she was sorry. She said she had not seen this coming either. She said the last part looking directly at me, and I remember believing her in that moment because she had never lied to me before. I did not argue with her. I did not know how to argue with her. I asked her if she was sure. She said she was sure. I asked her if there was anyone else. She said, and I still do not know whether this is true, that there was not. I asked her if there was anything I had done, anything I could change, anything I could say. She shook her head very slowly and said no, that it was not about me, that it was about her, that she needed time. She moved out of the apartment 3 days later, not to her parents' original house, which was still standing empty and awaiting demolition, but to the new house, into one of the 4 bedrooms I had built. Her parents were in 1 bedroom. Her brother's family was in 2 others. She took the 4th. I sat in our rented apartment that first evening after she left, and I looked at the photograph on my phone of the move-in day 48 days earlier, and I began to see the sequence for the first time. The house was finished. The family moved in. 6 weeks later, she asked for separation. Not before, not during, after. It was as clean a temporal correlation as any variable I had ever plotted on a graph. I called my daughter Lisbeth that night. She was at home in Utrecht. It was late for her, early morning in Longjuan. I told her what had happened. I told her the sequence. I told her about the 6 weeks. There was a long silence on her end of the line, and then she asked me, very gently, if I remembered the question she had asked me before the build had begun. I remembered. She had asked me, over a video call, when I had first described the project to her, why I would build a house I could not own. I had given her a good civil engineer's answer, all about land use structures and marriage and trust, and how the arrangement was standard in Vietnam, and how the family document we had drawn up was sufficient in a functioning family. She had listened, and she had not pushed, and I had felt that I had answered her satisfactorily. On the phone that night, she did not remind me of my answer. She did not say I told you so. She only said that she was sorry, and that she loved me, and that we should perhaps find me a lawyer. She found me one within the week. His name was Dr. Willem van der Steen, and he was a Dutch lawyer of Vietnamese descent, based in Eindhoven, who specialized in cross-border legal issues for Dutch citizens with Southeast Asian holdings. Lisbeth had found him through a colleague. She arranged a video call between the 3 of us for the following Tuesday. I sent Dr. van der Steen my entire binder of documentation in advance, scanned page by page over 3 long evenings in the empty apartment. Every receipt, every invoice, every contract, the signed family agreement, the architectural drawings, the bank transfer records. The call lasted an hour and 40 minutes. Dr. van der Steen was a patient, methodical man, the kind of professional who explains difficult things in the simplest possible language, because he has learned that his clients cannot absorb them any other way. He walked me through the legal landscape point by point. Foreigners cannot own land in Vietnam. A structure on land you do not own is legally attached to that land. The land use rights, held jointly by Nhoc's parents, controlled the house. My marriage to Nhoc did not create any enforceable right for me over property registered to third parties. The family agreement I had signed was, in his professional opinion, worth what it was worth as an expression of the family's stated understanding and no more. In Vietnamese law, it would be treated as evidence of a gift, not as evidence of a contract creating ownership. I asked him whether I had any legal recourse at all. He was careful in his answer. He said that in principle, in a Vietnamese court, I might argue for unjust enrichment. I might argue that my contribution to the construction of a marital asset entitled me to some form of compensation in the event of a divorce. These were theoretical arguments. In practice, he said, pursuing them would mean litigating in a Vietnamese court, in Vietnamese language, against a local family with local knowledge and local connections, over property registered to Vietnamese citizens who were not directly parties to my marriage. The likely realistic outcome, he said, was somewhere between nothing and a small fraction of what I had spent, after years of proceedings, whose legal costs would consume most of any award I might eventually receive. He paused there. And then he said the sentence that I have not been able to stop hearing in the years since. He said, and I am giving you his exact words as I recorded them in my notebook that afternoon, "Mr. Vandermeersch, the documentation is perfect, and the legal position is very weak. You have receipts for a gift the law will struggle to recall." Lisbeth was on the call. She did not say anything. She only put her hand up to her mouth and looked at the camera with an expression I have not been able to shake either. I thanked Dr. Vandersteen. I told him I understood. I asked him what he would recommend I do. He said that in his professional opinion, based on his experience of similar cases, the wisest course of action was to accept the loss, protect what remained of my assets, and return to the Netherlands. He said that pursuing the matter would cost me more money and more years than any conceivable recovery would justify. He said he was sorry. I paid his fee and I ended the call, and I sat in the empty apartment in Longjuyen for a very long time. I would like to tell you that I accepted his advice immediately. I did not. Over the following 2 months, I spent another approximately 12,000 euros consulting a Vietnamese lawyer in Can Tho, gathering additional documentation, exploring the theoretical avenues Dr. Vandersteen had described. The Vietnamese lawyer, a courteous man named Nguyen Dinh Quoy, was even more direct. He looked at my binder, he took my consultation fee, and he told me, in careful English, that he would take my money to pursue the case if I wished him to, but that in his honest assessment I would lose, that the process would take 4 to 6 years, and that in the meantime the family would continue to occupy the house, and there was no legal mechanism that would remove them. I flew back to Eindhoven at the end of that second consultation. I did not tell Ingark I was leaving. I did not have any conversation with her family. I packed the belongings I had brought to the apartment over the years. I paid the rent through the end of the month. I left the keys with the landlord, and I went to the airport. I did not go to say goodbye at the new house. I could not. The first 6 months back in Eindhoven were the worst months of my life. I want to be honest about that too. I did not descend into any dramatic collapse. I did not drink myself into oblivion. I did not fall into a depression that required medication. I simply sat for days at a time in the apartment I had once told myself was a temporary base while I built my life in Vietnam, and I did not know what to do next. I want to talk about the money, because I know that is what many people watching this will want to hear about. I lost, in total, close to 350,000 euros on the Vietnam chapter of my life. 290,000 of that was the house. Roughly 55,000 more was the accumulated cost of 3.5 years of shared living, travel between countries, small support for Ngoc's daily expenses during periods when her own income had been interrupted, and the modest engagement ring I had bought her before we married. Roughly 12,000 more was legal fees. I was not destroyed by the loss. I want to be clear about that too, because I do not want to overstate my case. I had savings of roughly 480,000 euros before the house project began, in addition to my monthly pension of about 3,800 euros from a combination of my Dutch state pension and my occupational engineering pension. After the loss, I had roughly 123,000 euros left in savings, my Eindhoven apartment, which I own outright, and my pension income, which continues without interruption. I am a comfortable man, materially. I will not run out of money. I will not lose my apartment. I will not have to work again. In that sense, I am one of the fortunate victims of this kind of story. But the money is not the wound. I need to say that clearly. The money is not the wound. The wound is the specific humiliation of a man who spent his professional life building things correctly and who used every ounce of that professional capability to build the most beautiful and most technically excellent structure he had ever designed, only to discover that he had been building an exit door. The wound is looking at that photograph from move-in day, 48 days before it all began to unravel, and realizing that the house had not been the beginning of anything. It had been the finishing of something. The project had been the relationship, and when the project was complete, the relationship had no further use. I want to tell you about the phone call I made in the second month back in Eindhoven, because it was the beginning of something that I did not know how to name at the time and can only now, 3 years later, begin to see clearly. I called an old colleague named Bas Verhoeven. Bas is 64 years old, a fellow Dutch civil engineer, retired now, living in Con Tho in the Delta with his Vietnamese wife of 22 years. His wife is a woman his own age named Trun Thier Mai, who was a school administrator when he met her and who is now retired herself. Bas had been part of one of the Delta project teams I had worked with over the years. We were not close friends, but we were professional friends who liked each other, and I had seen him and Mai twice during my Long Xuyen years, when I had made the 2-hour drive south to Con Tho for a weekend. I called Bas because he was the one person I could think of who had lived a version of the life I had thought I was going to live, and who might understand what had happened without requiring me to translate it. I told him the story. I told him about the house, the 6 weeks, the lawyer, the photograph. He listened, without interrupting. When I was finished, he was silent for a while, and then he said, in the flat Dutch of a man who was not going to soften anything, that he was very sorry, and that he had seen this happen before, and that he did not think it was my fault in any moral sense, but that he thought I might benefit from coming down to Con Tho and sitting for a few days with him and Mai. I flew back to Vietnam 3 weeks later on a fresh tourist visa, and I took the bus from Ho Chi Minh City down to Con Tho. I did not go through Long Xuyen. I could not face the possibility of running into anyone who knew me. Bas met me at the bus station and drove me to their house, a modest single story on the outskirts of the city. And Mai welcomed me at the door with the kind of quiet dignity that Vietnamese women of her generation carry naturally, and I stayed with them for 8 days. I want to describe those days, because they were the days when the story began, finally, to reorganize itself in my head into something I could carry. Bas and Mai's life was small and full. They had a garden that Mai tended in the mornings. Bas did handyman work for a few of the local expats, mostly to keep himself busy. They had 2 grown children, one in Con Tho and one in Ho Chi Minh City, who visited on weekends. Their house had not cost Bas any large sum of money because they had bought it together over many years out of his salary and hers, in Mai's name, without any drama and without any of the elaborate legal constructions I had once thought were the mark of a serious cross-border marriage. They lived on his Dutch pension and her small Vietnamese one. They cooked together in the evenings. They spoke to each other in a mixture of Vietnamese and English that they had developed over 2 decades. Mai teased Bas about his slow Vietnamese, and Bas teased Mai about her flat Dutch vowels, and it was the easiest household I had been in for years. On the 3rd or 4th evening, Bas and I sat on their small back terrace with 2 beers, and I finally told him the thing I had not been able to tell anyone else. I told him that I could not stop looking at the photograph from the move-in day, that I could not stop reconstructing the 6 weeks in my head, that I could not stop asking myself whether Anak had planned it from the beginning, or whether it had begun as something real and only slowly become a plan, or whether it had never been either, and had simply been what it had looked like at each moment along the way, a woman who liked me while the project was in motion and who no longer needed me when the project was finished. Bas thought for a long time before he answered. When he did, he said something that I have carried with me since. He said that in his experience, from what he had seen among the many Dutch and other European men who had come to the Delta over the decades and who had married Vietnamese women, the question I was asking myself was the wrong question. The question was not whether it had been a plan from the beginning. The question was, what conditions had made the plan possible? He said that in a marriage where the foreign partner is the sole source of a large capital project, and the local partner's family is the sole beneficiary of that project, and the legal structure of the country makes it impossible for the foreign partner to have any enforceable claim on the outcome. The marriage becomes structurally unequal in a way that eventually tests every human relationship to its breaking point. Some marriages survive that test. Most, he said, do not. His marriage to Mai had survived it, he thought, because they had never structured it that way. Because they had bought a small house together, in her name, And because he had never funded anything for her family beyond a share of small, ordinary contributions, and because Mai had her own pension and her own life, and had never needed anything from him except him. He said this without any of the smugness that a man in his position might have permitted himself. He said it as a diagnosis, not as a judgment. Mai brought us more beer, and she sat with us for a while, and she said very little. But at one point she reached over and put her hand on my arm and said, in her careful English, that she was sorry, and that not everyone in her country was like Ngoc, and that I should not let one story become all stories. It was the kindest thing anyone had said to me since Ngoc had told me the marriage was not working. I flew back to Eindhoven at the end of those 8 days, with something I had not had before. Not resolution, not forgiveness, not even acceptance in any complete sense, but I had a name for what had happened. Boss had given me the name in one sentence on the last evening as we were walking down to the river to look at the boats coming in. He said, and I remember this exactly because I wrote it down that night, that the problem was not that Ngoc had tricked me. The problem was that I had built what I had been given a reason to build, and I had not asked whether the reason was real. He said gently that as a civil engineer, I had spent 34 years learning to check the foundation before I built the structure, and that in the case of my Vietnamese marriage, I had built the structure first and forgotten to check the foundation at all. I have thought about that sentence many times in the 3 years since. It is the truest thing anyone has said to me about my own life. The engineer forgot to check the foundation, not the concrete foundation. The concrete foundation was perfect. I checked it myself. The other foundation, the one underneath the reason for the building, the one that would have answered the question of whether the woman I was building for was building with me or was letting me build for her. I want to say something now about the family, because I know that people who watch these stories often want to know what happened to the people who took the money. I have almost no information on this point. Ngoc did not contact me again after I left. I did not contact her. The divorce, when it was eventually formalized, was handled by lawyers in both countries and took nearly 2 years to complete. Because Vietnamese divorce proceedings involving foreign spouses are procedurally cumbersome, there was no financial settlement, because there was nothing to settle. She kept nothing of mine, because I had brought nothing to the marriage that was legally hers. The house was not part of the settlement, because the house had never legally been part of the marriage. It had been a gift to her parents, in the formal legal sense, from the moment its walls had risen on their land. Her brother Le Van Phuc continued to call me for a while after I left. He called 4 times in the first 2 months. Each time he had a small technical question about the house, a leaky tap or a fuse that had blown or a shutter that would not close properly. Each time I answered him briefly and told him he could contact the contractor who had built the house for further help. On the 4th call, I finally said to him, quietly, that I would not be answering any further calls about the house, and I asked him to please pass along my request to the rest of the family. He was silent for a moment, and then he said he understood, and he thanked me, and he wished me well, and I hung up. He has not called since. I do not know whether Ngoc has remarried. I do not know whether she has moved to a different city. I do not know whether her parents still live in the house, or whether it has been rented out or sold, or whether it has stayed exactly as it was on the day I last saw it. I have thought sometimes, in the years since, of asking a Vietnamese contact to drive past and simply tell me whether the front door is still that deep, glossy green. I have never done it. I do not want to know. The house exists in my memory as it was on the day of the move-in photograph, and I have decided that this is the version of it I will keep. I want to end with a few things I would want you to take from this story. If you have listened this far, I do not want to give you a list of red flags. I do not think my story was full of red flags. That is part of what is important about it. If it had been full of red flags, I might have caught it, and then it would not be a warning worth listening to. The value of my story, if it has any, is that it happened despite the absence of the obvious warning signs, because it operated on a deeper level than the obvious ones. The first thing I would say is that if you are considering marrying or entering a serious long-term relationship with a person from a country whose legal system does not permit you as a foreigner to own property, And if that relationship is going to involve you funding significant construction or purchase of property in that country, please, please take the legal question as seriously as I took the concrete mix question and did not take the legal question. Do not let a competent local lawyer's calm voice reassure you into treating a genuine structural weakness in your position as a technicality. Sit with the weakness. Ask yourself, what happens if the relationship ends after the project is complete? Ask yourself, what happens if the family decides they no longer need you? Ask yourself these questions before you sign the first check, not after the roof is on. The second thing I would say is that if the person you love is offering you a large project to fund, please distinguish carefully between what they are asking for and what you are offering. In my case, Knock never asked. I offered. It was, I now understand, the most sophisticated version of the mechanism. A person who asks for a large sum of money from a partner is a person whose partner has an opportunity to say no and to notice the request. A person who arranges the conditions in which their partner will offer the sum and who declines it gracefully once or twice before accepting it is a person against whose maneuver almost no defense exists. The lesson I take from this is not that all such offers are traps. Boss and Mai's marriage began with no such offer and has lasted for 22 years. The lesson is that when you are the one proposing something large, you should ask yourself, quietly and honestly, what conditions in your own life and in your partner's life made it feel natural to you to propose it? If you can answer that question cleanly, perhaps the proposal is sound. If the answer is that you were the lonely one and your partner's family had a leaky roof and it just seemed like a nice thing to do, please slow down. Slow down and think about what the completion of that project will change in the shape of your relationship. The third thing I would say is more personal, and it is the thing I most wish someone had said to me before I began. If you are a man like me, a man who has spent his life being useful, being the one who solves problems and builds structures and delivers projects, please be careful of a relationship in which your usefulness is what you are most valued for. That is not love. That is employment. Love does not need you to build anything. Love simply needs you to be there. In the marriage I thought I had, I was needed to build something, and when the thing was built, I was no longer needed. I do not believe that Ngark set out coldly and cynically to use me. I believe, if I am being generous, that something in her had learned to see me as a resource before she had learned to see me as a person, and that once the resource had been extracted, she did not know what else I was for. That is not a con story. Exactly. It is a story about the terrible ease with which a man can allow himself to be seen as a resource, when what he most wants is to be seen as a person. The fourth and last thing I would say is the simplest, and it is what I would tell my younger self if I could send a message backward across the years. I would tell him that a house is not a marriage, that building something correctly is not the same as building it for the right reason, that the foundation of a marriage is not the foundation of a house, and that a civil engineer, however good his training, is only qualified to check one of those foundations, and that the other one has to be checked by the same tired human faculty of judgment that every other human being uses, and that no amount of professional expertise excuses him from the work of using it. I am 67 years old. I live in an apartment in Eindhoven with a view of a canal. I see my daughter Lisbeth every second weekend and my son Joris slightly less often, and both of them treat me with a gentleness that I do not entirely deserve and that I am grateful for every day. I have started walking again, in the mornings, along the canal, in the way I used to walk in the first 2 years after my first marriage ended, before I convinced myself that I needed to build a second life on the other side of the world. I read more than I used to. I have taken up drawing, in a small, clumsy way, and I have joined a Thursday evening group at the local community center, where 6 of us sit around a table and sketch simple objects and drink tea. 2 of the other members are also divorced. 1 is a widower. We do not talk about our reasons for being there. It is enough that we are. I still hear from Boss every few months. He writes short emails from Kantho, telling me how the garden is doing, telling me what Mai has planted, sending me a photograph now and then of a boat on the river. He does not press me to visit again, He does not tell me to move on. He is simply there, the way a friend is there, without expectation. I have not been back to Long Xien. I do not know if I will ever go back to Vietnam at all. I do not blame the country. I do not blame the people. I do not even entirely blame Ngoc, though I have been through my periods of blaming her too, and I would be lying if I said I had reached some perfect philosophical calm about what she did or did not do. What I have reached, I think, is something more useful than calm. I have reached a place where I can look at the photograph from the move-in day, on the rare occasions when I look at it, and see the man in it not as a fool, but as a man who was doing his best with what he had, and who was missing something important that no one had ever taught him to look for, and who paid a very high price for that gap in his education, and who is now, in his 60s, at last beginning to learn. I built a house that will stand for 60 years. It will outlast me by decades. Somewhere in Anjiang province, on a raised concrete plinth 30 centimeters above the highest projected flood level, with a hip roof pitched at 32 degrees and a rainwater cistern buried in the yard, and a front door painted the deep glossy green that Ngoc's mother chose. That house is standing this evening as I record this message. It is, in strict engineering terms, the finest thing I ever built. It is also the most complete proof I ever produced that I had been building for the wrong reason, on the wrong ground, for people who wanted the building and not the builder. And it is the reason I am sitting in an apartment in Eindhoven at 67 years old, telling you my story, hoping that somewhere among the people watching this, there is one man who is about to sign a check for a construction project in a country whose law will not protect him, and who will hear my voice at the moment he lifts the pen, and who will put the pen down, and who will do what I did not do, and check the foundation before he builds the house. My name is Peter Hendrik van der Meersch, and this was my warning.